Good to have each one of you with us today. Looks like we're going to have a beautiful day for a change, and certainly looking forward to that. We appreciate so much all of the prayers that have been offered on Caleb's behalf. As I mentioned before Bible class this morning, Caleb is doing outstanding. Today is the first day that he's really complained much about any kind of pain or soreness. But they told us that was to be expected. But he has certainly done a lot better than I did when I had the procedure done. And so Caleb is doing great, and we appreciate so much all of your prayers on his behalf. As well, we have some with us today that have not been able to be here for some time due to sickness, and we're glad that you're feeling better and able to be back with us today as well. Want to encourage all of you that can to come back this evening. Tonight is going to be our question and answer night for the month, and we've got a couple of questions that we're going to be examining tonight. And they are on subjects that I think most of us have probably thought about at one time or another. And so encourage you to come back this evening, be with us at 6 o'clock for our question and answer night. Back during World War II, a proud German officer fell into the hands of the British Army. He was severely wounded and was immediately taken to a field hospital. As the doctors examined him, they realized that in order to save his life, he was going to have a blood transfusion. Well, as they were setting up all of the equipment to give this man this life-saving blood, he awoke from unconsciousness just long enough to look at the doctor and say, "Is that British blood that you're going to put into me?" And the doctor said, "Well, yes, it is." He said, "Then I would rather die." And he did. A missionary to India told of seeing a Brahmin, which is the highest ranking person in the Hindu religion, fell into a river and began to drown. Well, a man from the outcast society, the lowest class in the Hindu religion, jumped into the river and pulled this man to safety. As this man came back to consciousness, instead of being thankful to this man for saving his life, he berated him for touching him with his unclean hands. In 1939 in Ridgely, Tennessee, there was a popular African-American gospel preacher by the name of Marshall Keeble. Many of you have probably heard of Brother Keeble. He was concluding his lesson for the night. He extended the invitation, and as was the custom, there was a great number of people that responded to the invitation that night. But one of these men, as he come down the aisle, he was a white man, he got to Brother Keeble and he punched him in the face with brass knuckles, leaving him scarred for the rest of his life. Even today, we pride ourselves and we call ourselves a civilized society. But we would be hard-pressed to read the newspaper, to turn on the news, or to listen to the things that are being said on the radio and not hear of some type of prejudice that still takes place around us even still today. And in Jesus' powerful parable of the Good Samaritan, we find that he addresses this subject, among others, head on. But also in this parable, we see that he addresses the priority of love. We see that he addresses the importance of practicing what we preach, and especially helping those who are in need. It all started with a lawyer. A lawyer stood up and he challenged Jesus. He asked Jesus a question in Luke 10 and verse 25. Now, the lawyers of the day, they were some of Jesus' greatest critics. And they were always trying to find ways that they could trip Jesus up. But who were these people? What was their purpose? Well, the lawyers were the ones that were experts in the law of Moses. They were religious people. They were all from the tribe of Levi, and they were the ones who held a threefold job in this this system of faith that was known as Judaism. Number one, they were to study and they were to interpret the law. They were the ones that should have had the knowledge enough to be able to tell everyone, this is what the law says and this is what the law means. But also another part of their job is they were to instruct Hebrew youth. They were to indoctrinate them with the old law to teach them the things that they needed to know in order to grow up into strong Jews. But also, they were to come to decisions on questions of the law. But mind you, as we get into this parable this morning, something I want you to keep in mind. These lawyers had to come from the tribe of Levi. And as such, these lawyers came to be known simply as Levites. And we will notice this again as we go through this story this morning. Notice verse 25. It says, "And behold, a certain lawyer stood up and tested him, saying, Teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life?" Now, although this man's motives were less than pure, he asked the right question, didn't he? He asked the question that each and every human being must come to the point of asking at some point in their life. What must I do in order to be saved? Well, he asked Jesus this question, and Jesus responds in verse 26 in kind of a unique way. I can remember when I was in school, sometimes I had teachers that would answer questions with other questions, and it always got on my nerves. If I ask a question, I just want a straight answer. But notice this is what Jesus does. He asks two questions of this lawyer. He says, what does the law say? What's written in the law of Moses? Well, first off, this is a question that this man should have already known without a shadow of a doubt. But then the second question, what is your reading of it? How do you understand that? How do you interpret what the law says on this matter? So notice what he says. He puts the responsibility upon this man. Jesus could have simply opened his mouth and told him the answer, but he wanted this man to use the knowledge that he had of the old law to answer the question for himself. He knew that this man was trying to trip him up. He knew that this man was trying to get him to say something he could use against him. And so rather than cater to what this man was trying to get him to do, he's putting the burden of proof upon him. You answer the question. You know the law. How do you interpret what the law says on this matter? Which brings us to a classic truth. In verse 27, this man, this lawyer, he answered and he said, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself." Folks, this wasn't a lucky guess. This was the right answer. And it came directly from the law of Moses, Deuteronomy 6 and verse 5, and also Leviticus 19 and verse 18. Well, Jesus tells him, you got the right answer. You've answered correctly. Do this, and you will live. Notice what Jesus is telling this man is that if you will do what you have just said, if you will love God and you will love your neighbor, then you're going to enjoy an abundant life here, and you're going to enjoy an eternal life when this life comes to an end. But notice, this is just a backdrop for what is about to happen. This is just setting the stage for the question that this lawyer really wanted to ask. He says, well, if that's the case, then who is my neighbor? Well, this question was supposed to put Jesus on the spot. Jesus was not going to answer this question as the Jewish leaders would answer this question. The conclusion that the rabbis of the day had come to was that Jews only had a responsibility toward other Jews. In fact, they had gone so far as to say that if a Jew killed a Gentile, then they could not be punished. If a Jew saw a Gentile in need of help, then they should not feel compelled to help that person. See, Gentiles were viewed as lesser entities. They were viewed as of lesser significance because they weren't God's chosen nation. The Jews had an elevated impression of themselves, and so they began to believe that they were a superior group of people. They were a superior nation, and everyone else had to be subservient to them. Well, folks, ironically, this is very similar to what the Islamic Quran teaches. Muslims have no responsibility. Muslims have no reason to feel love and compassion toward anyone other than other Muslims. Well, folks, if Jesus had simply replied to this man and said, everybody is your neighbor. If he had simply said, Jews, Gentiles, Samaritans, everybody is your neighbor. Folks, this man would have thrown a fit. He would have stirred up a mob, and that would have been the end of this conversation right then and there. But I want you to notice how skillfully Jesus answers this question. And when he comes down to it, he again places the burden of proof upon this lawyer and expects him to answer the question for himself. So he tells a parable. Parables are simply stories that are used to make a point. Jesus answered and said, a certain man went down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell among thieves, who stripped him of his clothing, wounded him, and departed, leaving him half dead. It was 17 miles from Jerusalem to Jericho, and this road was one of the most treacherous in the ancient world. In fact, it came to be known as the path of blood. And the reason that is because the terrain that surrounded this road was so rugged and so treacherous that it was the ideal location for evil men to hide out and wait on their victims to come to them. Well, we have this poor man. We're introduced to this victim for the first time in verse 30, but we know very little about him. We can deduce from the context of this parable that he was a Jew. He was traveling from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he had the bad luck of running into some of these thieves. They came out, they beat him up, they tore his clothing off of him, they stole whatever possessions he may have had with him, and they left him there at the side of the road half dead. Now I want you to picture this image. Here was a man whose clothing was left in tatters. His voice was likely muffled if he was able to speak even at all. Here was a man who, due to the beating, his facial features likely were not going to be discernible. He was in pretty bad shape. He had been left for dead, and he was completely helpless, completely dependent upon someone else to come along and take care of him. Folks, ironically, that's the very same place we find ourselves when we commit our first sin. We find ourselves in a position where we are completely helpless, and unless a Savior comes along to help us out of that, then we are going to die. We are going to be lost. Well, I can imagine at this point the audience is all ears. They want to hear what Jesus has to say next. Well, verse 31 says, now by chance a certain priest came down that road. Well, this audience probably thought, well, this is this man's lucky day. This is our most holy person in the Jewish religion. This is the one that's supposed to be setting the example for us of the way that we're supposed to live. Surely this man is going to come to his aid. This priest is going to be there to help him. But Jesus says that when he saw this man, he passed by on the other side. This took all the breath out of the crowd. This was like a punch in the gut to these people, because this was not what they were expecting. Here was the man that they entrusted with their sacrifices. This was the man that they entrusted with their spiritual well-being, and he would not even come to the aid of this suffering man. Well, if the priest isn't going to help, then who is? Well, verse 32 says, likewise, a Levite. Now, you remember what I mentioned to you a few moments ago. What had the lawyers come to be known as in many circles? Folks, Jesus puts the man in the story. He puts the man right there in the story. He says, and likewise, a Levite, when he arrived at that place. So here we go. Here's a Levite, an expert in the law of Moses, the one that should know what he's supposed to do in this situation. This Levite, he's going to save his life. Well, the Levite came along, and he did a little bit more. He went over and he looked at the guy. He went over, he checked him out, he saw what the situation was, but he didn't do anything to help. He continued right on down the road. But folks, this is about the equivalent of us gawking at the scene of an accident. And you know what I'm talking about. Anytime we drive by and we see a car accident, we press our face to the windows. We want to see what's going on. We want to know all the details. We want to see if it's somebody we know. But how often is it a situation where we can actually do something to help? Well, many times we can't. But what if it was a situation where we could? What would be our attitude in that situation? Well, folks, we think about these men. The priest and the Levite, they didn't do this to this man. They weren't the ones that beat him up. They weren't the ones that stole from him. They weren't the ones that left him laying there to die. They didn't really do anything wrong, did they? Well, yeah, they did. They were guilty of the sin of omission, the sin of neglect. We're told in James 4 and verse 7, to him who knows to do good and does not do it, to him it is sin. Here were two men who knew that they needed to come to this man's aid, who knew that they needed to help, but yet they could not be burdened with it. Folks, whenever we see someone who is in need that we can help, folks, that's the situations. There's some situations that we just can't help. There are some things that we may come upon. There are some situations of life that people may be facing that we just don't have the skills, we don't have the knowledge that's necessary to help. But when we see someone who is in need that we can help, and we don't do anything to help that person, folks, that's wrong. That's sin, and that's the point that Jesus is trying to get across to us in this verse today. But we find that even more pointed is a statement from John in 1 John 3, verses 17 and 18. He says, but whoever has the world's goods and sees his brother in need and shuts up his heart from him, how does the love of God abide in him? My little children, let us not love in word or in tongue, but in deed and in truth. Folks, and then one of the hard lessons that we see in this parable is that love demands action. Love demands also helping more than just our brother. Paul writes in Galatians 6 and verse 10, as we have therefore opportunity, let us do good unto all men, especially unto them who are of the household of faith. Folks, there are some Christians today who believe, kind of like the Jews did, that they are only expected to help those who are in their circle of fellowship. But you know, it's shocking whenever we realize what Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 5, verses 44 through 46, where he says, but I say to you, love your enemies, bless those who curse you, do good to those who hate you, and pray for those who spitefully use you and persecute you, that you may be sons of your Father in heaven. For he makes his sun to rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the just and on the unjust. For if you love those who love you, what reward have you? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? Folks, what is Jesus telling us in that passage? Is he saying that as Christians we only have a responsibility to our brethren? No. He says we're to do good to everyone that we have an opportunity to do good for, even those that we may consider our enemies. Well, let me bring that a little bit closer to something that we may understand better today. Folks, what if Jesus was teaching this parable to us at Pyburn Street today? Instead of using a priest and a Levite, he may use a preacher and an elder. He may use a deacon and a Bible class teacher. He may use a song leader. But folks, what he is saying is that we cannot ignore the needs of others. If we place ourselves into this story, where do we see ourselves? Well, hopefully we haven't seen ourselves yet in the story. Because the examples we've seen thus far is not the attitude that a Christian is supposed to have in these regards. Well, by now, this Jewish audience is probably thinking, well, if the priest didn't help, if the Levite didn't help, then it's probably going to be just a common Jew. Just someone like you and I. It's going to be just the average person is going to come along and is going to help this person. Well, Jesus was about to bust their bubble. He was going to tell them something that they just could not fathom. Verse 33. Jesus says, but a certain Samaritan. Now, folks, I can imagine at this point, and the text doesn't tell us this, but I can imagine at this point that there were probably some in that audience that said, whoa, Jesus, hold on just a minute here. You don't know what you're saying. Surely a Samaritan is not going to come along. You don't want to put a Samaritan into this story. A Samaritan's not going to help him. A Samaritan's going to come along and finish the job. Well, folks, before we go any further, I want to share with you just briefly some reasons why the Jews had this kind of feeling about the Samaritans. It's interesting that the word or the name Samaritan literally means keepers of the law. And the reason that is because those who were Samaritans, they would only accept the first 5 books of what we know today as the Old Testament. They would not go beyond what was taught in the law of Moses. They would not listen to the interpretations of the Jewish leaders of the day. But they had not always been this way. Those who came to be known as Samaritans were those who had originally been a part of the old nation of Israel. The Assyrians came in 721 BC and destroyed the nation of Israel and carried 27,000 people away into captivity. Well, after they had been in servitude to the Assyrians for some time, then the Assyrians allowed them to go back and repopulate this land where they had once lived. They went back to this former land of Israel and they established themselves as the nation of Samaria at this point. They came to be known as Samaritans. Well, at this point, many of them had intermarried with some of the other nations around them. They were no longer seen by the Jews as a pure lineage from Abraham. And so they were seen as half-breeds. They were seen as lesser significance, and therefore they were not worthy to be a part of God's nation. Well, as they came back to Samaria, they recognized the importance of getting back to a position of faithfulness to God. And they, over time, came to be more faithful to the law of Moses than the Jews were. Now, this is something that did not remain. Eventually, they went off into idolatry and other things, as many of those nations did. But there was a core part of that nation that remained faithful to the law of Moses. But really, they maintained an attitude of civility until about the year 9 AD. And in the year 9 AD, during the time of the Passover, there were some of the Samaritans that, I don't know the reasoning behind this, it's not been chronicled in history for us, but during the middle of the night, they brought a bunch of bones And they cast those bones into the temple in Jerusalem, therefore desecrating that place upon one of the holiest days of the year to the Jews. Well, from that point forward, the Jews wanted nothing to do with the Samaritans. There was a consensus of hatred and strife that was there among these people, and it got to the point that by the time of Christ, we read there in John 4 and verse 9, Jews do not associate with Samaritans. And then you remember when Jesus traveled through Samaria and was meeting with the woman there at the well, she said, this isn't supposed to happen. Jews aren't supposed to associate with Samaritans. We're not supposed to be talking to each other. But folks, what we see taking place in this parable is both racial and religious animosity. There was hatred there on two fronts that should not have existed at all. But what had happened was this hatred had led the Jews to believe that all Samaritans were evil. That there was nothing good about these people whatsoever. Well, Jesus says that as this Samaritan came along, he saw this man and he had compassion upon him. The word compassion comes from a Greek word that means a deep felt emotion. He truly was moved by the situation that he saw this man in, and he jumped at the chance to help. He saw this Samaritan lying there, suffering, half dead, and he knew that he could help. He knew that he had the ability to help, and it struck a chord with this man. But I want you to notice just what all he did, what all he gave in assistance of this man. Notice verses 34 and 35. It says, so he went to him. Folks, first off, he gave of his time. The priest and the Levite, they weren't even willing to do that. He gave of his time. He bandaged up his wounds. Folks, he gave of his energy. He put effort into helping this man. He poured on oil and wine. He gave of his possessions in assistance of this man. He set him on his own animal. Folks, he gave his own transportation, his own mode of transportation to this man. And he was now on foot. Brought him to an inn and took care of him. Folks, he gave strength to this man, gave of his efforts. And on the next day when he departed, he took out 2 denarii. He gave of his money. He gave financially. And he gave them to the innkeeper and said to him, take care of him, and whatever more you spend when I come again, I will repay you. Folks, he gave a blank check to this man. You ever thought of it that way? He told this innkeeper, anything this man needs, do it. Take care of this man, and when I come back, I will make sure it's done right. I will make sure that you are taken care of. Folks, remember the robber's approach was what's yours is mine, and I'm going to take it. The priest and the Levite, their mentality is what's mine is mine, and I'm going to keep it. But the Samaritan, his mentality is what's mine is yours, and you can have it. An old preacher once put it this way. He said, when love floods our hearts, it is like oxygen filling our lungs, and a genuine need arising is like a trumpet placed upon our lips that we cannot help but sound off. But too many times, our brethren do not have enough air to play a kazoo. Folks, what he is saying is far too often there is a lack of love. A lack of genuine love for the needs of others. And what Jesus is saying here is that this must be more than a feeling. It must be more than just a emotion that we feel. We must be willing to take action. James 2 and verse 16 puts it this way. It says, and if one of you say unto them, depart in peace, be ye warmed and filled, notwithstanding ye give them not those things which are needful to the body, what does it profit? He said if we see someone who's in need, we have the ability to help them, and all we do is we tell them, well, I hope you get what you need. I hope you're able to find the assistance that is necessary to help your situation. But we don't do anything to help that person. What really good has it done? It hasn't done any good. It's not benefited that person, and it's not provided a spiritual blessing for us. But folks, genuine love, like genuine faith, requires action. Genuine love is not one that has to be poked. It's not one that has to be prodded. It's not one that has to be motivated in some way. Love is not able to sit still when a need arises. Christians should always be the first ones on the scene to offer assistance when a need arises. Well, we're running short of time this morning, but I want to get to the end of this. So Jesus gets to the end of his story, and he turns back to the lawyer. And he asks a question. He says, okay, who showed mercy on him? Who showed mercy on this man? Verse 37. Well, folks, this was Jesus' message from the beginning. Matthew 7 and verse 12 says, therefore all things whatsoever you would that men should do to you, do you even unto them. So he asks the question, who showed mercy upon this man? Folks, two issues tended to plague these lawyers. And some of these continue to tempt us today. Number one, they wanted to limit who their neighbors were. They wanted to limit who they were required to assist. But also, they weren't willing to practice what they preached. This is why Jesus says, woe unto you also, ye lawyers, for ye laid men with burdens grievous to be borne, and ye yourselves touch not the burdens with your fingers. Matthew 23 and verse 4. He says, you tell people this is what you have to do, but then you're not willing to do it yourself. They were so focused upon the theory, so focused upon what the law of Moses said, but they weren't willing to do what the law of Moses said. So Jesus asked him this question, who showed mercy upon him? Well, folks, this lawyer couldn't do anything but give the right answer. He said it was the one that helped him. The one that helped him. Jesus said, then you go and do the same thing. Go and do likewise. In other words, he tells this man, stop talking and start doing. Folks, whenever we see someone, whether they are our brethren or not, and they are in need, then we should be moved to help them in every way that we can. For some, that may simply be offering a prayer on their behalf. For some, it may be picking up the telephone and calling them and giving them a word of encouragement, or sitting down and sending them a card to encourage them during their hard time. For others, there may be times that we're able to assist them with preparing or purchasing food to provide for them in a difficult time. Or it may be that we have the ability to financially assist someone in their time of need. Whatever the situation may be, if we have the ability to help someone, then we have the responsibility to help someone. And this is why Jesus tells us in Matthew 5 and verse 16 to let your light so shine before men, that they may see your good works and glorify your Father which is in heaven. Folks, whenever others see the love of God in us being shared with others, regardless of what the situations may be, regardless of what society around us tells us what's acceptable and what's not, when we come to the assistance of others, folks, we are letting our light shine to the world. We are showing the love of God to others, and it will lead others to wanting that in their life as well. The message of this parable is one that is very plain. It is to encourage us in our Christian life to go out and seek opportunities to assist others, to bring others to the Lord, and to help those in their time of need, whether they are our brethren or not, whether they are friend, whether they are foe. We have that responsibility. So the question that we need to ask ourselves this morning is this: are we out looking for opportunities to help those who are in need? Are we seeking out those chances where we can shine the light of God's love to those in those difficult times of life? Folks, there are things that we all can do. There are areas in this life that we can reach out and help others. And folks, it does not take that much effort. But ultimately what it comes to is, are we helping others to come to the Lord? Are we helping others to see that they need to be a child of God? And it may be this morning that there's someone here that you examine yourself and you find that you're not living your life the way that you should. You realize that you're still a part of the world, and that you want to have the love of God in your life, that you want to have the forgiveness of your sins, that you want to have the hope of a home in heaven. Then this morning, if you have faith in Jesus Christ, repent of your sins. Come forward, confess that faith, and be baptized into Christ. Or it may be that there's someone here who is a child of God and you've strayed away from the truth and need to be restored. Or maybe you're going through a difficult time in life and you need the prayers and the encouragement of your brothers and sisters. This morning, if you have a situation in your life that we can help you with in any way, then we encourage you to come while together we stand and sing.